talk today about where we're at in light of the Supreme Court judgment in the UK earlier this year, where we are and where we're heading. The judgment was unequivocal that the word sex in the UK Equality Act 2010 meant biological women and did not include men who had the sexual fantasy commonly called a gender identity that they were women. The implication is that all spaces and opportunities set aside for women must do so on the basis of biological sex. I realise that for so many of our WDI community who do not live in Turf Island, such a verdict seems unimaginable at this point. And I realise too that musing on what we do next may seem unkind, considering that things are continuing to get worse in countries like Canada, for instance, and many others. And there is, of course, still a huge fight in the UK, as the transgender activists and their supporters are fighting a very determined rearguard action to defeat the meaning of the judgment and to prevent it from having any practical effect. We've had male barristers who dress up as women and some who present as men, all giving misdirection about what the judgment means. We have the Welsh Government, as we heard earlier today, and other organs of state saying that they do not know what it means and cannot possibly change anything about their toilets, for instance. Meanwhile, we have court cases continuing which are likely to force them into action.
It's a bit further away from you.
There is all manner of mischievous delaying tactics going on. There are many signs too, though, that things are headed in the right direction. Toilets are being relabeled in many establishments, for instance. I've seen them. Now, I'm assuming that in the UK, however, along the struggle, the fight for women's spaces, opportunities and sports will be won. It seems most likely too that the struggle to end the transgendering of children is well on the way to success. These are all the most obvious aims of the feminist campaign for women's sex-based rights. We have reason to be very hopeful about these things. But is this enough? I will argue that we need to understand where this current explosion of men's sexual rights activism came from and combat it at source. It's no good simply aiming to put it firmly back in the closet, because it will still cause harm to the wives and children of these fetishes, for instance, and we heard Emma talking earlier today. That would still go on. We need to attack its very foundation, which lies in men's sexual hatred and subordination of women. First of all, I will look at some of the reasons alongside the Supreme Court judgment that should cause us to be hopeful. There are many signs that social and political views are changing, both in response to the judgment and as a gradual response to the way opinions are changing. YouGov, which is a market research company that does opinion polling for public bodies and business in the UK, has tracked public opinion on what it calls transgender rights over a few years. Their polling from last December shows there's been a steep decline in public support for the goals of transgender activism. It found, for instance, that when it comes to whether the state should allow people to legally change their gender, the figures are reversed from what they were only a few years before. Now only 34% say it should, but 48% say it should not. And this is a considerable victory. It really does matter. For instance, that when it comes to whether the state should, sorry, I've just said that. So my Britain's 55% say they believe that allowing transgender women to use spaces reserved for women, such as women's toilets or changing rooms, presents a genuine risk of harm. 57% say there should be no surgery on the National Health Service, and only 26% say they should be. So all of this is very considerable, and in the end, it's not going to be possible for this movement to make a progress on many of its absurd aims when the general public increasingly is completely unsympathetic to this happening. So in this country, we have come a long way. The cause of transgenderism is no longer seen as progressive. The momentum is all in reverse. It's also very unusual and fascinating for there to be this kind of change of opinion in which the public turns against a section of the population that many had previously accepted that they should tolerate and even celebrate. In fact, I can't imagine that there's anything else that could be anything like this. And I keep saying someone's got to do their PhD on it. Please. Now, presently, judgments in favour of women's sex-based rights and against men's fetish expression are becoming delightfully common. 2 weeks ago, there was a judgment in favour of Lindsay Smith, a gender-critical lesbian, who was expelled from Newcastle United Football Club for her views. She took a case against her local police force for the prejudice they showed in attending last year's Pride March in uniform and with a Pride-coloured police car. A judge found her to be in the right, and this year's police may not attend in uniform, and the force should not show its favouritism towards one point of view. There have been many cases of this kind. I won't talk about the Sandy Peggy case today. Somebody's already mentioned it, but I think most of us probably know how important that is. That's the case going on at the moment about the Scottish nurse with the doctor who wanted to flash his gender identity in. I mean, more and more, I do think we need to see it as being a light flashing indecent exposure, in fact. Yeah. Now, another sign of progress is the backlash against the politics of pride, of which the change in opinion towards transgenderism forms the most important part. With a good deal of evidence that pride events and imagery are a great deal less popular with the public and with corporations and public bodies than they were even last year. There was much media coverage last month of the extent to which Pride had lost its corporate sponsors. New York Pride lost 25% of support. Similar losses have been experienced all over Europe, including the UK. Athens Pride, for instance, lost 30%. So these are significant losses, so there's a change going on. The media coverage puts this down to the Trump effect, but there was already evidence that the enthusiasm for that part of Pride that promotes transgenderism had soured. And I hope that positive lesbian politics will lead to more lesbian strength marches, and maybe serious gay men could reinforce, but I'm a bit doubtful. I don't want the attack on pride to mean that it's not possible to express positive lesbian and gay politics in public, because that would be a very serious problem. Now, however, this cannot be all we want. The progress of the men's sexual rights movement of transgenderism has, over the last 3 decades, been very considerable and has threatened women's sex-based rights and increased the societal spread of misogyny and violence against women in a wide variety of ways. I do not think that simply getting men out of women's spaces and opportunities is sufficient. Even after fetishistic men have been turfed out of all women's spaces, toilets, changing rooms, women's ponds, sports, prizes, and awards, even after we have ended the transgendering of children, harms will remain. These men are likely to want to express what they call their gender, actually meaning their masochistic sexual fantasies, in public places, in workplaces, to the detriment of women workers, and in their home, the detriment of children. Now, it worries me when I hear women say that surely it's okay for men to imitate women as long as they're not threatening our spaces. And I do hear this quite a lot, which would mean very little change at all. We've got huge amounts doing their dress up absolutely everywhere, and they would simply continue to do that. As long as they're not saying they're women and they're not in the toilets, it would be okay. And believe me, a few decades ago, this was not happening. So it means they've made huge gains. In fact, they would have made huge gains. So I think it's not okay, and it should never be okay. So I'm talking about how we end transvestic fetishism permanently. Okay, so that's a big task, and we have to work out how to do that. Yes. Now, this acceptance is past, why are women saying it's okay, if these chaps are just out there in the women's dresses? This acceptance is partly based on deference. They really don't want to challenge on what is seen as their prerogative to behave as they want. But partly it results from an unwillingness to confront the fact that the behavior is a sexual perversion. It is not about gender non-conformity. It is not the case that because women wear trousers, men should be allowed to wear dresses. This is not the problem that we are faced with, and that really, really needs to be understood. And there's a misunderstanding about that, particularly when it comes to clothing in the workplace, and I'd like to say a bit more about that later on. If it was simply about gender non-conformity, then women would be doing all this too. They'd be, in the toilets, filming themselves masturbating in the men's toilets and all. Amazing. They are not. So we know that's not what wearing trousers is about for women. So it's a specifically male sexual perversion, and all the scientific literature on this says that. It's a male sexual perversion. This needs to be understood, and one of the reasons why I often don't get invited to speak in places, I think, is because I say this. Right? I say it's a sexual perversion, and this is seen as somehow not quite nice. Really not quite nice. And we must be nice. Right? However, transgenderism is a sexual perversion, and the behavior needs to be understood as a form of sexual perversion, which is spreading hugely today because of porn consumption. The background to this development is that there are movements now to normalize and bring out into public space a wide variety of other male sexual perversions, all being fired up. Many of you will have heard me talk about this at last year's conference, for instance. Men are developing genres of pornography, consumer industries, political movements, conferences out of perversions such as being furries, out of nappy fetishism, out of the voyeurism and indecent exposure that are expressed in naturism, and very many more. There he is, yes. Now, on Thursday, the case was covered in The Guardian of a surgeon called Neil Hopper. This is Neil Hopper. So Neil Hopper, who could deny these things, is from Cornwall. He's a surgeon who had performed many leg amputations in his work. He had also amputated his own legs and was a member of the Eunuch Makers Amputation Network of Gay Men, who do penis amputations and other things. A couple of them have received prison sentences, I think, in the last little while, but it is very serious what they are doing. Now, this is all part of a well-known sexual perversion called apatemnophilia, or more politely, body dysmorphic disorder, which is quite similar to, of course, what transgenderism is also called. So they're understood as dysmorphic disorders. Little problem about what your body looks like, having two legs, for instance. Now, the transvestism is just one form of the porn-constructed behavior that its sexual practitioners are normalizing at this time. So you understand why I say it is not okay for men to just wear dresses, because their wearing of these dresses is a sexual perversion. And in fact, one of the things that's quite interesting is the way in which, in more and more situations, these men are wanting to take forms of occupation, like in care homes where they can do gerontophilia, for instance, or in nurseries where they can rape children and so on. So that they are looking for forms of occupation like leg amputation, an unusual one you might think, where they are able to exercise their sexual perversions in the workplace. I know it's not polite to say this, and people would say, can you say it? But no. Look at Neil Hopper, for instance. Yeah. basis of the behavior is clear from the fact that there's a tsunami of transvestism at the moment, and it's the result of the Pornography Revolution. According to the annual Pornhub Year in Review in 2022, the platform's transgender category experienced a huge boost in searches over the previous 12 months, growing by over 75% to become the 7th most popular section. It became the most viewed category in Brazil. What's happening in Brazil? As well as the 3rd most popular in both Italy and the United States. And this porn-constructed behavior will continue to be created so long as the pornography exists. So we still have to deal with the harms that these hobbyists cause to women. Though transvestism has a long history, it has mostly been carried out in secret rather than in public space. The present takeover of culture and politics by this practice relates to pornography. Now I've got a slide 3 here, and I'm not sure what it is. Can we have slide 3 so I can find out? Yes. This relates to the issue of it's okay for the men to wear what they like. Right. Now, this is a chap who's gone out in a costume that he finds sexually satisfying for him. Now, the difficulty is that these men do wish to wear these costumes wherever they can get a reaction from women, because it is like indecent exposure. They want the reaction. Right? And we probably don't want him in the tea room at work, or even sitting next to us in the workplace. Now, is that a prejudiced and unreasonable reaction? Because men should be allowed to wear what they like. Right? So obviously men can't wear what they like, because we don't want this man in our tea room wearing what he wants to wear. So there's got to be a discussion about what that might mean. Right? This issue of they should be allowed to wear what they like. Surely they can wear what they like if they're not pretending to be women. There has to be limits. And for the moment, with the fetish, there are not limits. They are going out in their nappies. They're going out like this, and they're going out, in porn costumes and all sorts of things. And they do want to be in the workplace wearing whatever they want. So if anybody says to you, surely they should be allowed to wear what they want, I think you will quite reasonably say, no, this is the problem. Okay, so I want to move on to looking at the harms from the sexual perversion that will still exist after the men are expelled from women's spaces. There are 2 aspects to the sexual perversion of men's gender expression that will still exist even when men are out of women's spaces and children are no longer being transgendered. They will outlast the defeat of the idea that men engaged in these behaviours can actually change sex, as they existed long before that delusion was created. And indeed, I've been talking to a couple of women here today already about, how a few decades ago, and one of them, of course, is Emma, who we heard from earlier. 2 decades ago, none of them were saying they were women, not even were women, but they were doing all the problematic behaviours, right? So the Supreme Court judgment doesn't necessarily supply us with a solution. Now, both of these behaviours have to be dealt with. One is the way in which the heterosexual men who are autogynephiles require women to form an unwilling audience for their fetishes so that they can get sexual satisfaction. They display in front of us, whether we like it or not, and force a reaction in a similar way that flashers do when they display their penises and get erections from our horrified or fearful response. Now, this gives them pleasure, right? So they will continue to do this, even though they may well say, well, I admit I'm not a woman, but. This is a particular problem in the workplace where women have no choice to leave or avoid the behaviour, and they are starting to use the workplace, and as we know, not just from the Sandy Peggy case, but others. So the men do want to be able to go to work in these costumes and display and create a reaction from the erection. And that's a problem, whether they say they're women or not. The other is the way in which transvestites perform woman face as a form of entertainment in drag and comedy, which is, of course, an insult to women. Men's imitation of women should be understood as insulting to women, as blackface is understood to be insulting to black people. Womanface constructs and promotes the hatred of women. Now, these behaviours are being performed on a mass scale now, whereas only a couple of decades ago, women and girls would be unlikely to observe them. There were very few transvestites, or few who performed in public, and drag was a pretty secret activity. Those were better times. Do we want to go back there? Precisely. Do we want to push the fetishes back into the closet, or do we need to achieve more than that and remove the basis of the perversion, the existence of femininity, the gender of female subordination? If there's no femininity, then none of these male behaviours make any sense. Now, I just want to go on and talk a bit more about cross-dressing as entertainment. One form of woman face that will should men from women's space, men dressing up as women for amusement. Whilst gay men generally practiced drag until the recent explosion of RuPaul out of the public eye in private venues, there was throughout the 20th century and continues today to be a great deal of cross-dressing by men in comedy shows on the TV and in Hollywood movies, which made transvestism seem a bit benign and entertaining rather than insulting. Men dressed up as women to create for themselves hugely successful careers. They mostly imitated what they saw as typical middle-aged housewives, and there were very many of these shows. I mean, there's far too many for me to mention to you today, but I could do a book on it. Now, one of them from the 1970s and 80s TV in the UK was Sissy and Ada, two gay men, themselves as drag act featuring two fictional housewives from northern England, for example. I think this might be slide 4. Can we go? Sissy Braithwaite and Ada Shuttlebottom. They've got obviously northern names because being working class and northern is hilarious, as well as being women is hilarious, as well as being working class is hilarious. It's all incredibly funny. You know, of course, that there is no equivalent. Women cannot do any of this, imitating men and choosing northern names and so on and so on. This is simply not possible. So what we're talking about here is laughing at insults, insults on the basis of race and location, sex, and so on. So these are two housewives, Sissy and Ada. The men who imitated women for laughs, as I say, are very numerous. Some were gay, some were heterosexual. They include Dick Emery, Les Dawson, and Barry Humphries from Australia, who starred on TV in the UK. Now, the woman hatred that inspired these comedians was sometimes particularly clear. And one such occasion was in 1982, when the DJ and comic performer Kenny Everett, I remember him, some of you here might, appeared on the Parkinson chat show in the UK. Can we have slide number 5? Parkinson was a hugely admired and respected interviewer, but on this occasion, his guest chose to epitomize pure misogyny in his person. That says Cupid stumped, because that's what he was calling himself on this occasion. You know what he means, don't you? You know what he means. Is there anybody here who has any doubt as to what Cupid stunt actually refers to? Yes? It means stupid, C-U-N-T. That is the point. Right? So he's calling himself this on the Parkinson's chat show. The name stupid C-U-N-T couldn't have been said on TV because it's a vicious insult for women. So he chose to simply change the consonants around, but everybody knew what he meant. Everybody laughed. One of the things that I find extraordinary about this woman hatred is that women laughed too. Women were expected to laugh. Women did laugh. How did that happen? And how do we end it? That women laugh at the total humiliation and hatred of themselves, which is about having such a low status, you cannot expect dignity. You cannot expect dignity. Now, there's also happening in the UK right now. Could we have slide 6? One of these shows making fun of middle-aged women. It's called Mrs. Brown's Boys. It's pretty much the most successful show on television, on the BBC, BBC One. I've never watched it. I couldn't watch it. And when I talked about it with other women, they all said they couldn't even dream of watching it either. But women are clearly watching it because the audience figures are absolutely huge. This is the most popular show on television. The hatred of middle-aged housewives are roaring with laughter at them. I mean, it's an extraordinary situation. How are we going to make any progress whilst that is the case? Can we have slide 7? I think we need a slide of Barry. This is Barry Humphries. He died a couple of years ago. Utterly vile, and yet he totally celebrated all over all the newspapers. Everybody was saying how terrible it was. He was the most wonderful man. He loved women, and he was so funny. But he's just doing ordinary roaring with laughter of women because women are so funny. What is it that if women don't dress up as men, which is not something that happens very often, everybody doesn't fall about laughing? Well, we know why. Kate, you want to answer that question?
Saunders did very, very funny skits of the building.
Very good. And I think somebody's mentioned to me Rachel Saunders.
The time, and we were perhaps in a different situation.
Yes, I think it's possible. I think it's possible, but obviously not in quite the same way, because men are powerful. Therefore, they're not hilarious. They're not the underclass, and men's clothing is powerful. And therefore, women putting on men's clothing, if I put on a nice suit, a nice trouser suit, as they used to be called, because we were supposed to wear skirts in those days, but I had a little thing for trouser suits. If I put on a trouser suit, everybody will not fall about laughing. In fact, they're likely to respond with slightly more respect because it's the clothing of respect. Right? So that's the difference between men being able to do women and get the laughs from everybody, including women, and its opposite. So I'm going to talk about drag now. Drag is a form of woman face that's particularly powerful as a motor in the creation of woman hatred at this time. Drag is the form of cross-dressing that gay men have traditionally engaged in, and which was once a form of gay male behaviour restricted to prostitution and subterranean clubs. It's really about prostitution, because heterosexual men in particular like to be able to sexually use men pretending that they're women, so that it doesn't show that they're homosexual, right? So that's always been the case. It's the equal case in cultures all over the world, where some boys are always feminized, as in the travestis and the hijras and the lady boys and so on. Boys are turned into girls for sexual use of men. It's not just a wonderful sort of gender diversity going on. It's prostitution. So in the last couple of decades, drag has come out of the closet and now dominates popular culture. Shows like RuPaul's Drag Race, which started on TV in 2009, has now morphed into myriad varieties in many countries. Let's just have slide 8.
Oh, it's going to take a second again.
I've never watched RuPaul's Drag Race either. I don't know when anybody here would. I mean, we are not attracted, those of us here at least, to the total humiliation of ourselves, as it were. Yes, this is just a group of them. So these men who enact a distillation of woman hatred then graduate into being role models for women. Drag queens, who often started in their careers in these shows, are now ubiquitous in chat shows and popular entertainment and so on and so on. Even Portrait Artist of the Year in UK has had a couple of them and so on. Very swiftly, drag queens came to be seen as experts in teaching beauty practices to women, and they're all over social media, teaching women how to be women, how to wear terrible makeup and how to distort their bodies and so on. They're absolutely everywhere. They're making a great deal of money, and they work for the beauty companies as well, who employ them to do all of these things. Their usual trajectory is to win or at least star in RuPaul's Drag Race, and the woman hatred of drag is clear in the judging criteria for the show, and the judging criteria, which are charisma, uniqueness, nerve, and talent, happen to spell CUNT. Right? So the word CUNT is everywhere in this horrendous imitation of women. So if you ever had any doubt about whether it was about respect for and art women beautiful, you need to look at the language and find what's happening, which I'm sure to watch it, but I can't. Now, the word may not be acceptable on the screen, but it can be prominent in the background in this way. So they may not go around talking about CUNT. But the show also includes extreme woman hatred in the use of the term fish, signifying the smell of women's genitals. And these men use it to describe not only women, but also their colleagues who do the best imitations of women. They're the ones called women's genitals smell like fish. In the show, there's also a content called the Snatch Game. A snatch is the name which men use for women's genitals, I guess because they snatch them. It's a Trump-like activity, I guess one could reasonably say. And the Snatch Game is in RuPaul's Drag Race. It's one of their competitions. I think let's have slide number 9. I've got it. Okay, this is one of the winners of RuPaul's Drag Race. You can probably see various problems there. I've no idea why he's got something like an oxygen tank attached to him. Maybe he's sexually excited by disability as well, as many men are, unfortunately. He's got a cinched-in waist, and he's looking like a sort of 1890s Folie Bergère girl. I mean, that's presumably what he thinks women should look like, and this is what wins the competition. The oxygen tank is extra. Now, so this is an example of the models, and drag is huge now. You're probably all aware of it. Drag queen story times are foisted on children, and so on and so on. So we need to end the performance of drag. I need to get to the end. I really need to get to the end. So none of the men I've been showing you in the slides pretend to be women, so they're not affected by the Supreme Court judgment. But they do have something in common at the basis of all the ways in which men do woman face and drag queens. Ideology of gender, i.e. the idea that women are different and inferior to men, and they should display this difference through something called femininity. Whilst it remains, there will continue to be woman face. Woman face will have meaning, whilst the femininity that it represents is accepted and practiced by women and defended by many feminists. To defeat woman face, we have to defeat it for women as well as men. Men know that the practices of femininity signify subordination, and that's why they find them exciting. But for many women, this is not well understood. And I think this is something we really need to work at. So I want to end on a positive note. I often see the feminist language that we're developing appear in the mouths of politicians and journalists, and in places where I do not expect to see it. The term sex-based rights, for instance, which comes from our declaration, is now widely used internationally by all kinds of people. We need to achieve this with the term woman face too, and with the understanding that transgenderism is perversion. I think we will achieve this. Thank you for listening.